Yasher koach, Mike. I'll start with a story this morning. Nestled inside a rough linen sack was a seed. It had slumbered in the quiet dark of the barn since last autumn's harvest, so it was startled and not at all pleased when the sack began to move. But after a few minutes, it began to enjoy the rhythm of the footsteps of the farmer who was carrying it. It liked the way it slid against the smooth shells of the other seeds in the sack, and the way the farmer whistled happily to himself. But nothing lasts forever. Change always comes. The seed was terrified when it was plucked from the sack, dropped into a hole, and covered in rough earth. At first, the seed panicked to be alone without its fellow seeds. But then, it took in the delicious metallic scent of the dirt and the luxury of a burrow all to itself, and it began to relax. But nothing lasts forever. Change always comes. The sleeping seed awakened to find its shell was cracking open. White filaments it didn't know it possessed were slowly but steadily working their way into the earth. The seed felt uncomfortable putting forth roots. It hardly recognized itself. But then it felt the strength of the earth's nutrients filling it with energy, and it came to admire its changing form. But nothing lasts forever. Change always comes. And no sooner had the seed adjusted to its roots than a green tendril shot through the other side of the seed, dragging it into the blinding sunlight of a field on a spring day. The seed had never stretched itself so fast. Indeed, it didn't recognize itself, for it was no longer a seed but a plant. But then it learned to enjoy the warm energy seeping into its leaves from the sun, and the way the rain cooled it from the outside in. But of course, and you may join me if you like, you know what I'm going to say next. Nothing lasts forever. Change always comes. It's a fact that's difficult for many of us to accept. From our first breath until our last, most of us resist and resent change. And yet, not only is change inevitable, it's also potentially good for us. Change doesn't just happen to individuals. It happens to nations, too. I once was seated on a flight from Toronto to Tel Aviv, next to a man with a black hat and a beard. He was a friendly fellow who struck up a conversation with me. We chatted about this and that, but after a while he asked me, "So what do you do for a living?" Seeing as it was a 12-hour flight, and we'd be sitting next to each other the whole way, I evaded. I said I was studying to be a Jewish teacher. "How wonderful," he said. "Will you teach in a day school?" I confessed that I was studying to be a rabbi. His response was that I was an abomination to Judaism. Since the peace was already broken between us, I persisted. I asked him, "Why do you say that?" He said that I was disrespecting a tradition that hadn't changed in 5,763 years. To which I responded, "Well, neither of us is going to sacrifice a goat at the temple when we get to Israel, right? I mean, come on. Judaism has been transformed. We have moved from being a religion of sacrifice and priesthood to one of prayer and study. Things do change," I told him, "and if we hadn't moved away from Temple Judaism and embraced Rabbinic Judaism, we might not be sitting here today, so why not move toward egalitarianism?" He did not appreciate my response. Like many humans, he resisted the idea of change. He did not speak to me for the rest of the flight, while I pored over a volume of Talmud. Indeed, change is often critical for our survival. Psalm 126 teaches, "Halok yelech uvacho, nosei meshech hazara, bo v'yavo verina, no It means, though he goes along weeping, carrying the seed bag, he shall come back with songs of joy, carrying his sheaves. The Malbim tells us this verse of Psalms is a metaphor for our exile into Babylon and our return. As the crushed Israelites made their way on foot from home to Babylon under the tyranny of Nebuchadnezzar, they carried their seed bags with them. They were refugees weeping for their losses and the uncertainty of their future. And yet, when they returned home after their exile, it was with joy. For the seeds they'd planted in a foreign land had grown into sheaves of grain that sustained them. Not only did they return home joyfully, but the Israelite community was changed forever because many of them stayed behind in their adopted home of Babylon. And it was here that the Babylonian Talmud, a foundational book of Judaism, was written about 500 years later. Without the defeat and the uprooting and the exile in Babylon, who knows if we'd be sitting here today? In 1990, the Dalai Lama invited Jewish leaders from around the world to visit him at his temporary home in Dharamshala, India, and share our wisdom on how to survive spiritually when we are in exile. His people had been exiled from Tibet in 1959, and he wanted to learn from us. The Dalai Lama received wisdom from 8 rabbis and Jewish mystics. The secret, they said, was preserving the traditions that mattered, but ultimately being able to adapt in an ever-changing environment. Judaism has adopted the traditions of many cultures it's inhabited and incorporated them into Jewish practice, from Greek symposiums that turned into Passover seders to the adaptation of Buddhist meditation into modern Jewish practice. We are a nation who has changed. When people grumble to me that meditation practice simply isn't Jewish, I remind them that Passover seders used to be banquets for Greek philosophers and that the first seders were probably pretty controversial. Change doesn't just happen for nations, it happens for God as well. On Yom Kippur afternoon, we read the story of Jonah, a prophet who was instructed by God to go to Nineveh and tell them that God was displeased with them and they would soon be destroyed. Jonah ran away from the mission. After surviving a storm at sea and being eaten by a whale, he eventually delivered God's message to the people of Nineveh that in 40 days their city would be overthrown. The people of the great city repented and God spared them. The book closes with Jonah sulking outside the city because the prophecy that he didn't want to give in the first place had not come to pass. God caused a tree to miraculously grow over him, providing shade. And just as miraculously, a little worm eats the tree from the inside out. It withers and dies. When Jonah protests the loss of the tree, God points out all the more so God would grieve the loss of a city full of people. It is unfathomable to Jonah that God changed God's mind. Having committed to a path of doom and destruction, Jonah can't accept the change. And yet, if he had paid closer attention to the words of the prophecy, perhaps he would have been more open to the change in God that occurred. In chapter 3, verse 4, Jonah tells the people of Nineveh, Od arba'im yon, v'ninveh ne pachet. In 40 days, Nineveh will be overturned. Rashi points out, nepachet means overturned, not destroyed. And so it has 2 possible meanings, both bad and good. If the people don't repent, overturn means done. But if the people do repent, overturned means they have done tshuva. They have turned themselves over. All change has the potential to change us for the better. Change overturns us. It has the potential not just to deconstruct us, but to rebuild us. We are in the season of change, a miraculous time of year when through the process of reflection and tshuva, all people have infinite capacity to change, which may be the most terrifying thing that any of us can think of, because who will we be if we change? We started this sermon with the story of a seed that became a plant. But we didn't finish the life cycle story of that seed. Eventually, that plant would experience yet another change. When fully grown, it would be harvested. Some of its seeds would nourish people, while others would be preserved for planting. And of course, another potential ending for the plant is that it will wither like Jonah's tree. Yet even those endings are opportunities for growth, for the seeds that fall in withering are the beginnings of another cycle, another opportunity for change. Cycles of change are unending. So what changes have you experienced this year? Have you resisted or accepted these changes? May we all have the blessing of being overturned in the year to come. Gamar Chatima Tova.